On the afternoon of June 19th, 2001, 44-year-old Debbie Triplett and her husband Billy were stocking shelves in the small country grocery store that they owned in Clay County, Alabama. Billy and Debbie had run the store together for almost 20 years, and they had stocking shelves down to a science. They barely even had to look while they were doing it. So today, like most days, they spent the time talking and joking with each other. For as long as they'd been doing this, Billy and Debbie never got bored working at the store together. In fact, they didn't understand how anyone would get bored working with the person they loved, because the two of them had been pretty much inseparable from the moment they met back in 1982. At the time, Billy, who was 8 years older than Debbie, already owned the grocery store, but he'd been having trouble running it by himself. So, when Debbie came in looking for a job, he'd hired her right away. And it didn't take long for them to discover that they had a lot in common. They were both single parents, they loved living in a small town where they knew their kids would be safe, and they could talk to each other for hours without ever running out of things to say. Billy and Debbie's relationship had quickly gone from boss and employee to boyfriend and girlfriend to husband and wife. And their children from their previous marriages ended up loving each other as much as Debbie and Billy did. So they had all quickly formed this really tight-knit blended family. Now, almost 20 years later, the kids had grown up and moved out, but they all lived close by, so the blended family was still together. In the store, Billy kept stocking the shelves, but Debbie glanced up at the clock hanging over the counter and said that maybe they should call it a day. Billy was supposed to meet up with their son Randy, and if he wanted to do that and still get home in time for the first pitch of the Atlanta Braves baseball game, he needed to head out now. Everyone who knew Billy assumed he must have been born in an Atlanta Braves baseball cap, because he wore one pretty much every day. They also knew he absolutely hated to miss a Braves game. But today, Billy wasn't sure if he should just take off, because he really didn't like the idea of leaving Debbie alone at the store. The couple didn't like to talk about it, but on a night about 3 months earlier, when Billy was closing the store on his own, 3 men wearing ski masks had burst in, duct-taped Billy's mouth, shoved him into the walk-in cooler, and then robbed the cash register. By the time Billy had gotten out of the cooler, the men were long gone, but all he could think was, thank God Debbie was not here. Debbie could see the look of concern on her husband's face, and she told him not to worry. Those robbers had not been seen again. Besides, their daughter Michelle was coming by to keep her company for a while, and then she'd close the store because she had dinner plans. Billy thought about it for a second, and then said she was right. So he gave Debbie a kiss and said he would see her at home when she was finished with dinner. Later that afternoon, Debbie's daughter Michelle walked into the store, and the two women immediately started talking like they were best friends. Debbie had Michelle and her brother Michael with her first husband, but they had treated Billy as their dad since they were young, just like Billy's son, Randy, saw Debbie as his mother. Still, Debbie shared a bond with Michelle that was special, even among the kids. They saw or talked to each other every single day. Time always flew by when it was just the two of them, and today at the store was no different. They talked about everything that was going on in their lives, and when Michelle finally caught a glimpse of the clock, she said she needed to head out. But Michelle hesitated, because like Billy, she wanted to make sure her mom would be okay on her own. Despite Billy and Debbie rarely talking about the robbery, Michelle and her brothers knew all about it, and they worried about their parents constantly. Debbie said she'd be fine. She could take care of herself, and after all, she'd been closing up the store for 2 decades. Michelle knew better than to argue with her mother, so she told her that she loved her, and then she left. Debbie worked a while longer on her own, then started closing the store. She emptied the cash register and put all the money into a metal lockbox. She turned off the lights and walked outside with the box under her arm. Then she locked the door behind her and climbed into her minivan that was parked out front. And as she drove down the secluded country road outside the store, Debbie felt excited about her dinner plans, and she hoped the Braves were winning so Billy would be in a really good mood when she got home. Early the next morning, Debbie's daughter Michelle sat straight up in bed. Sweat dripped down her forehead, and she could feel her heart pounding. She was terrified, like she'd just had a nightmare. But Michelle knew the fear she was feeling was not because of a dream. Michelle believed that her connection to her mother was something way stronger than a typical bond between mom and daughter. It was almost psychic, like they shared a sixth sense or something. It was like they always knew when the other one was upset or in trouble. And right now, Michelle knew something really bad had happened. She reached over and grabbed her phone off the bedside table and called her mom. When she didn't get an answer, she immediately hung up and called her brother Michael. The second she heard Michael's voice, she said something was wrong with their mom, and since he could get there faster, he needed to get over to her house right away. Michael never doubted the intense connection between his sister and his mom, so he said he was on his way out the door. Michelle hung up the phone, got dressed, and ran out to her car. She sped down the road that cut through most of the small rural towns in Clay County, and then a few minutes later, she turned onto a dirt road that led to her parents' house. As Michelle pulled up in front of the house, she saw her brother pacing back and forth in the yard, and she heard the sound of a police siren in the distance. Michelle got out and ran straight to Michael. He wrapped his arms around her tight and just said, "Sister, they're gone." Early that afternoon, Agent Todd Wheels of the Alabama Bureau of Investigation drove down a 2-lane road lined by acres of trees on one side and a river on the other. This landscape, that would cause most people to feel like they were stranded in the middle of nowhere, felt completely familiar to Agent Wheels. He'd grown up in Clay County, which was not too far from here, so for him, it was like he was coming home. That morning, a call had come into the Bureau from the Clay County Sheriff's Department. County deputies had responded to a 911 call at Debbie and Billy Triplett's house. The second they walked inside, they knew the Sheriff's Department did not have the resources to handle this case, so they had asked the state police for help. Agent Wheels turned onto a dirt road and slowed down as he approached an old white wooden house that sat on a large piece of land that backed up to dense green woods. County police officers had already set up crime scene tape around the perimeter of the house, and a couple of deputies stood out front with a man and a woman in their 20s. Wheels parked his car and looked out at the man and woman, and he felt his heart sink, because he had known both of them since they were little kids. Wheels had grown up in a town not too far from where Michelle, Michael, and their brother Randy lived with their parents, and they had always attended rival schools. So Wheels had seen the entire family at football games, academic competitions, parties, and church functions for most of his life. Wheels took a breath, stepped out of the car, and walked over to Michelle and Michael. He said he hated seeing them under these circumstances, but he needed to look inside the house, and then he would come back out to talk to them. They both nodded like they barely heard what he said, and Wheels ducked under the crime scene tape, put on a pair of gloves, and headed inside. But before he could even take a few steps, he saw Debbie's body lying on the floor. She was surrounded by a huge pool of dried blood, and there was blood spatter all over the walls. Wheels had worked homicides in much bigger places than this, cities that had reputations for violence, but this attack on Debbie looked as gruesome as anything he'd ever seen. He crouched down and found Debbie's purse beside her. He noticed bloodstains inside the purse, and it looked like somebody had rifled through it. Wheels thought this could be a sign that this was a robbery gone bad, that somebody had broken in, and then when they heard Debbie come home, they rushed over and killed her as soon as she walked inside. Wheels left Debbie's body and walked down a short hallway into the family room. And there, on the couch, he saw Billy's body, covered in blood as well. This was the first reported double homicide in Clay County in over 40 years, and Agent Wheels could not believe he knew the victims. Wheels approached Billy's body when something on the wall right above caught his attention. When he'd first walked into the room, he thought it was blood spatter, but now he could see it was red lipstick. And someone had used this lipstick to leave a message for the police. It was a single word: narc. At 4 p.m., several hours after Agent Wheels arrived at the scene, he was back in the family room, staring at the lipstick on the wall for what felt like the 10th time that day. But now he was with members of a state forensics team that had just arrived. Wheels had gone outside earlier to check on Michelle and Michael, and to ask them if they knew what their parents had been doing the night before. Michael said that he and his wife had met his mom for dinner after she closed the store, and then as far as he knew, she went straight home. And both siblings assumed that their dad had watched the Braves game and then just stayed in for the night. Back in the family room, Wheels and the forensics technicians could still not get over the violence that was inflicted on Billy. This was even more brutal than the attack on Debbie. This kind of rage made Wheels think that the attack must have been carried out by someone who had a close emotional connection to Billy. or by someone who was out for revenge. And the word narc also had strong connections to the drug world. As Wheels stood there, fixated on the wall, he heard people shouting outside, and he snapped out of his trance. He immediately turned around and ran out of the house. In the front yard, Wheels saw a man physically struggling with two deputies and yelling that he and his siblings needed to get inside. Their parents were in there. Wheels recognized this man as Billy's son, Randy. Back when they were teenagers, Wheels and Randy had been on their respective high school's Scholar Bowl teams, and they had developed a friendly rivalry with each other at academic competitions. Wheels darted across the yard, joined the deputies, and in his calm southern accent, told Randy he needed to back off. Randy stopped struggling and looked up at Wheels, and this look came across Randy's face like he didn't understand why this man was standing there. Randy squinted a little and then just said, "Tom?" Agent Wheels said he wished this was not how they were seeing each other for the first time in a while, but he needed Randy to calm down and step back. Randy took a deep breath and apologized to the deputies. He told Wheels he had lashed out because he was mad at himself. He'd missed the messages he'd gotten from Michelle and Michael, and he felt like he'd let his brother and sister down by not getting here earlier. Wheels said he understood. While the two men talked, Wheels heard someone shouting his name from across the yard. He looked over and saw a forensics tech standing by a minivan that was parked near the side of the house. Wheels told Randy to go wait with his siblings, and then he walked over to the van. The front passenger door was open, and the forensics tech said the van had been unlocked. He pointed to the passenger seat, and Wheels saw the keys to the van sitting there. But Wheels also saw something in the passenger side floorboard. It was an open, empty metal box turned over on its side. Wheels called out to the deputies to bring Randy, Michelle, and Michael over to the van, and when the three siblings got there, they didn't look surprised at all. Wheels asked them what the container was, and they told him it was the money box their parents put the cash from the register in every night when they closed the store. And their mom had a terrible habit of just leaving the box in her van when she got home. This clue definitely played into the idea that these murders were connected to a robbery, but maybe it was not a home robbery that got interrupted. Wheels asked the siblings if it was common knowledge around town that their parents put their money from the store in the box every night. Would someone have known Debbie had all that cash and maybe followed her home? The kids looked at each other for a moment, like they were talking without saying anything, and then Michelle said a few months earlier their parents' store had been robbed by some men at closing time, so these men might have known exactly where their parents put the money from the cash register. Wheels got a few more details about that robbery, and then he told the siblings they could go. They should have some time to grieve together in private. Wheels spent the whole day at the house, and it was dark outside when he met the members of the forensics team to get a final report for the day. They believed that Debbie and Billy had been killed the previous night. The team had also pulled blood samples from both bodies and from the rooms where they were found, and they had done a thorough sweep of the minivan. But the van appeared to have been completely wiped down before any investigators had even touched it. However, investigators were confident that with all the blood and all the fingerprints found inside the house, that they would still likely be able to get the print and DNA samples that belonged to the killer. At the time, DNA testing in Alabama was still a relatively slow process. It could take several weeks or even months to get results. Still, Wheels had a lot of faith in DNA testing, so he was willing to be patient. In the meantime, he had two distinct theories about the case. This was either a robbery gone bad, or Billy really had ratted somebody out to the authorities, likely over something having to do with the drug trade. On June 21st, so the day after the bodies had been discovered, Agent Wheels followed Michelle into her house, which was just a few miles away from her parents, and they sat down together in the small front room. Wheels spoke in the calm voice he almost always used on the job. He said he didn't want to imply that anybody was lying, but he had met with county police, and they had no record whatsoever of a robbery that took place at Billy and Debbie's store. So Wheels wanted to know what Michelle and her brothers had been talking about. Michelle sighed. She and her brothers were telling the truth. There had been a robbery. Their parents had just never reported it. Wheels looked totally confused by this. Why on earth would they keep something like that to themselves? Michelle laughed a little and said it was stupid, but her dad had been illegally selling wine and beer. and even a little moonshine out of the back of the store. And he thought if he reported the robbery, the cops would find out about it. In 2001, Clay County, Alabama was what's known as a dry county. This meant it was illegal to sell any alcohol within county limits. When Agent Wheels heard this news about Billy, he laughed just like Michelle had. This was the kind of thing he'd heard about his whole life growing up in Clay County. He knew Billy wasn't running some major bootlegging operation like people had done back during Prohibition. Instead, he was most likely just selling booze to his friends and to some people from town. But at the same time, Wheels could not shake the image of the word narc written on the wall above Billy's body. So he told Michelle he was not worried about Billy selling alcohol to his friends, but he needed to know if Billy was selling anything else illegal. Was Billy mixed up in the local drug trade? This question absolutely floored Michelle. She said there was no way her dad was dealing drugs. Wheels listened, and he didn't say anything, but he agreed with her. And not just because he had known Billy and the family. Wheels was familiar with the growing methamphetamine problem in the area, and he knew from working with colleagues in the state narcotics unit that a lot of the drugs were coming in from out of state, and that Billy did not fit the profile of most local meth dealers and users, who were often younger guys who didn't have steady jobs. So Wheels stood up and told Michelle that was all he needed for now. He said he'd check in with her as often as he could. But before he made it to the door, Michelle told him to wait. Wheels turned and walked back toward her. Michelle said again there was no way her dad was mixed up with drugs, but she did know somebody who was. It was a guy named Leonard Southers, and he happened to be one of Billy and Debbie's closest neighbors. Later that day, so still just one day after the discovery of the bodies, Agent Wheels pulled up to a house over a mile away from Billy and Debbie's. Michelle had been right. Everything was so isolated and spread out around here that this was definitely one of the closest homes to her parents. Wheels stepped out of his car, and he saw the lawn was completely overgrown and there were tools and a bunch of other stuff piled up all around. He took a few steps towards the house, and the screen door flew open. A skinny man in baggy jeans and a t-shirt rushed outside, demanding to know who Wheels was and what he was doing here. Wheels said everything was okay, and then asked the man if he was Leonard. The man nodded and said, "Who's asking?" Wheels introduced himself and said he was with the state police, but Leonard was not in any trouble. In fact, he needed Leonard's help. Wheels took a few more steps towards Leonard, and as he did, he could see track marks on both of his arms, clearly from injecting drugs. And the way Leonard fidgeted and picked at his skin made Wheels think he likely was a meth addict. Looking at Leonard, Wheels mostly just felt pity. This man obviously needed help, but that's not why Wheels was here right now. All of a sudden, Leonard raised both hands into the air to show he was not carrying a weapon, and then he moved towards Wheels. He leaned in really close and then pointed to the trees surrounding his house, and in a hushed voice, he asked if Wheels could see the men up there. Wheels turned and looked up at the trees, and as he did, Leonard started laughing. He said the men were in camouflage, so they were almost invisible, but he knew they were there. And he knew they were men like Wheels, agents that the government sent to watch him all the time. As calm as Wheels was, and as genuinely sympathetic as he tried to be whenever he was working a case, he knew he could change his personality on a dime when he needed to. It was like there was a switch in his head, and in that moment, Wheels flipped the switch. He stood up to his full height, raised his voice, and said Leonard was absolutely right. There were agents hiding in the trees, and if Leonard didn't tell him everything he knew about the deaths of Billy and Debbie Triplett, these agents in the trees would swarm. They would take Leonard away, and he would no longer be a free man. Leonard suddenly looked scared, but he quickly said he did want to help. He had heard Billy and Debbie got killed, and he was sad about it. They were nice people, both of them. Wheels flipped the switch again, and his calm voice came back. He told Leonard if he wanted to help, he needed to tell the truth and admit if he had gone over to Billy and Debbie's house to rob them, maybe for drug money. Leonard shook his head. He would never steal from them or try to hurt them. Wheels spoke with Leonard a while longer in the front yard, and by the time he left, he had a primary suspect. Leonard was a drug addict, and he was extremely paranoid. There was even a chance Leonard had convinced himself that his neighbor Billy was going to turn him in to the police for buying and using drugs, which in Leonard's mind would make Billy a narc. In the days following the murders, Agent Wheels had his team dig into Leonard's background and his history of drug use. Still, Wheels did not want to overlook anything, especially if it was because of a personal bias. He did not believe that Billy or Debbie had any connection to the local drug trade, but he needed to make sure. He asked for help from the state narcotics unit, and they said they would search their records to see if Billy or Debbie ever appeared as suspects or informants, or if any agents knew anything about them. In the meantime, Wheels was still waiting on the results of the DNA tests from the blood samples taken at the crime scene. But he did get an update on the fingerprints found throughout the house. At this point, all of the prints that had been pulled matched Billy, Debbie, and their kids, who had provided prints to the county police. So investigators figured the killer must have worn gloves, which probably meant they would not find any useful prints on the cash box either. This was not surprising, but Wheels still got frustrated. The investigation was in its early days, but he had hoped he might get lucky with the fingerprints and find a clear piece of evidence that pointed to the killer. Wheels always felt a real responsibility when investigating a murder to try to bring the killer to justice as quickly as possible, but he knew this case was something different. He had never worked a homicide where he actually knew the victims and their family, and so every day that he didn't find the killer made him feel like he was letting Michelle, Michael, and Randy down. About a week after the murders, Wheels got word from the narcotics unit that they didn't find anything on Billy or Debbie. It seemed pretty clear they had no connection to illegal drugs. In addition to that, because Billy and Debbie never filed a report about that store robbery, there were no leads on the men who had committed that crime. So, Wheels was basically where he'd been a week earlier, with the drug addict Leonard as his primary suspect. Still, Leonard being an addict and being paranoid about men in the trees did not automatically make him a killer. Wheels had to find something concrete to tie him to the murders. And about 1 week later, Wheels was going back over his notes when he got a phone call. And as soon as he heard the caller's nervous, shaky voice, he knew it was Leonard. And Leonard said that Wheels needed to come to his house right away because he had found blood on his money. Not long after this call, Agent Wheels found himself back in Leonard's front yard, not really knowing what to expect or what Leonard finding blood on his money even meant. Leonard stepped outside, walked over to Wheels, and showed him a stack of $1 and $5 bills he had in a shoebox. Wheels put on his gloves and picked up a few of the bills, and this didn't look like regular cash. The bills were faded, and there were these weird white spots on them, almost like bleach or something. And in that moment, Wheels understood what was going on, and he just stood there dumbfounded for a second, because he realized someone had put all of this money in a washing machine. They had literally tried to launder the money. This did seem like something Leonard might try, not understanding that money laundering was actually a complex illegal financial process that had nothing to do with detergent or bleach. But as ridiculous as all of this seemed to Wheels, a couple of things about these bills did look like major clues. Leonard's money, even after the laundering process, was grouped together in 1s and 5s, like it would be in a cash register. In addition to that, Leonard had not been using some kind of code or metaphor when he said he found blood on his money, because even though these bills were faded, Wheels saw several brownish red spots that he believed were bloodstains. To Wheels, this looked like it had to be the money stolen from the cash box that Debbie brought home from the store, and he assumed the blood on the bills either belonged to Debbie or the killer. Leonard must have sensed what Wheels was thinking because he got really jittery and blurted out that this was not his money. He had gotten it from another drug addict that he knew. Agent Wheels chose not to flip the switch in his demeanor. He stayed totally calm and said to Leonard, "Boy, that sounds like a pretty convenient excuse." But Leonard swore he was telling the truth, and he even told Wheels the name of this other drug addict. Wheels said he'd look into it, but he told Leonard he better not leave town. Wheels confiscated Leonard's cash, bagged it as evidence, and brought it to the county sheriff's station. Over the next few days, Wheels and his team dug into the background of this other drug addict that Leonard had mentioned, and then Wheels brought them in for an interview. At first, when Wheels asked about the night of the murders, he felt like he'd been right about Leonard lying. This interview was not going anywhere. But Wheels shifted his focus, and the interview suddenly took a complete turn. Because when Wheels brought up the money with the blood on it, this drug addict shouted, "That money you got from Leonard? That's my goddamn money!" Wheels just sat there, He couldn't even think of what to say next. He had dealt with a lot of different types of criminals over his career, but he had never heard a suspect just shout out something so potentially damning before. After the interview was over, Wheels let the drug addict go, but he quickly secured a search warrant for the addict's house, and he had the addict's car impounded. And when forensics experts searched the car, they found a faded bloody fingerprint on the driver's side door handle. The sample was sent off to the state lab for testing, and this time the lab expedited the test. So on July 26th, a little over a month after the murders, Agent Wheels got back those test results, along with the results from the initial DNA samples taken from the house. And Wheels knew he had found Billy and Debbie's killer. Based on DNA testing, interviews, and evidence found throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what state police believe happened to Billy and Debbie Triplett on June 19, 2001. That night, the killer quietly walked into Billy and Debbie's kitchen. They could hear the Braves game coming from the TV in the family room. The killer opened a drawer and pulled out a sharp knife. They carefully slid the knife into their back pocket and then walked into the family room. Billy sat up on the couch, and the killer immediately started shouting at him. Billy shouted back and was about to get off the couch, but the killer ran across the room and leapt on top of him. They struggled, but the killer pinned Billy down and without even looking, grabbed something heavy off the coffee table and started wildly slamming it into the side of Billy's head. Blood sprayed on the walls and all over the couch as Billy stopped moving. The killer got up, drew the knife from their pocket, grabbed Billy, and slit his throat. But the killer didn't stop. They kept digging the knife deeper into Billy's neck until they had almost decapitated him. Finally, the killer stepped back, walked away, and went to the kitchen. They washed the knife off, rinsed their hands and face, and set out some cleaning supplies. Then they picked the knife back up, went to the family room, sat down, and waited while the baseball game kept playing on TV. At 10 p.m., a few hours after the killer had arrived at the house, they heard a car pull up outside. They quickly turned off the TV and ran toward the front of the house, carrying the knife and the blunt object they'd attacked Billy with. They flipped off the light in the entryway and crouched down against the wall not far from the door. The killer heard footsteps just outside, and they clutched the knife tight. The door unlocked, and the killer saw it swing open. And before Debbie could even turn on the light or call to her husband, the killer leapt out of the darkness, grabbed her, slammed the blunt object into her head, and cut her throat too. Debbie's body collapsed just inside the door. The killer flipped on the light, put the knife back in their pocket, and grabbed Debbie's purse. They took out Debbie's car keys, and they saw a tube of lipstick. They walked into the family room, and with the lipstick, they scrawled the word "narc" on the wall over Billy's body. After that, they walked through the house, got the cleaning supplies they'd laid out in the kitchen, and then stepped over Debbie's body and went outside to her minivan. The killer opened the passenger door and saw the metal cash box on the floorboard. They found the key for the box on Debbie's keyring they'd stolen, opened the box, and stuffed the money from it into their pockets, getting blood from their hands all over the cash. The killer quickly wiped down the van with the cleaning supplies and tossed Debbie's keys onto the passenger seat. Then they ran to their car with their hands and pockets filled with cash, cleaning supplies, lipstick, and the murder weapons, and they drove straight home. The following morning, the killer woke up and saw several messages, but they ignored them and waited until later in the afternoon to go back to their parents' house. The bloody cash that Leonard had in his possession was the money from the cash box, but Leonard had told the truth. Another drug addict had given him that money. And this drug addict was Billy's son from his first marriage, Randy. And Randy was the killer. It turned out Randy's drug habit had been going on for years. He struggled to get work, and he almost never had any money. Billy had continually bailed his son out financially, but recently, Billy, and especially Debbie, had just had enough. and Billy had met with his son more than once to tell him they were cutting him off. On the night of the murder, Randy already felt angry and betrayed by Billy and Debbie. And so when he got to the house and saw his dad on the couch, he begged him to give him more money. But Billy said no way, he needed to get his act together and clean up his life. After that, Randy got the knife, argued with his dad again, and then attacked him on the couch with a blunt object, and then slit his throat. Hours later, Randy used the same weapons to kill Debbie. After murdering his dad and stepmom, Randy had the idea to try to make it look like a drug-related murder, so he wrote "narc" on the wall in lipstick. And he figured if that didn't work, police would assume this crime was connected to the earlier robbery at his parents' store. And Randy was right. Investigators focused on both of these theories. But during the investigation, Randy started to panic. And at one point, he literally tried to clean the blood off the cash he had stole in the laundry machine, but when that didn't work, he just gave the bloodstained cash to Leonard, assuming Leonard would hold on to it for him and keep quiet until the investigation died down. But Leonard called Agent Wheels and told him that Randy, who he'd known for a long time and who he did drugs with, was the person who gave him this money. Then, when Randy came in for questioning, he inexplicably shouted out that the blood-stained money was his. Wheels then moved in on Randy, his former Scholar Bowl rival, and had his car impounded. And the DNA sample that was taken from Randy's car door handle would match DNA samples from the crime scene. The blood belonged to Debbie, and Randy had just gotten some of it on his car after killing her. Randy was sentenced to life in prison without parole, but in 2016, he hanged himself in his prison cell. Michelle still thinks about her mother all the time, and she continually reminds people to hug the ones they love, because nobody, no matter how deep a connection they share, knows how much time they have together. One weekday morning in 2005, Gabriela Ortiz Herrera stood in her small kitchen in Boston, Massachusetts, stirring a pan of scrambled eggs. She stepped away from the stove to grab a stack of plates from her cabinet, and then she set them on the table just as her oven started to beep. She turned off the oven and pulled out a tray of biscuits. After setting the biscuits down to cool, she paused to take a deep breath and sip her coffee. For Gabriela, the last few days had been really hectic. Some of her relatives were visiting from the Bronx and New York City, and while Gabriela's 5-year-old daughter, Camilla, loved having her 4 cousins and her grandmother around, hosting the extended family was a big job, especially in their very modest apartment. Gabriela stirred the eggs until they finished cooking. Then she turned off the stove, set all the food on the table, and called to her family that breakfast was served. Gabriela's nieces and nephews came barreling down the stairs, followed closely by their grandmother, Maria, who was so young and energetic that she could keep up with the kids. And then a long moment later, Gabriela's 5-year-old daughter, Camilla, came down after them. Gabriela watched her daughter walk down the stairs very slowly and gingerly, keeping one of her small hands on the railing as if she were trying to steady herself. The little girl made it to the bottom of the stairs and slowly walked into the living room, but then she accidentally bumped into the coffee table and started looking around as if she didn't even understand that she had walked into the table. Gabriela asked her daughter if she was okay, and Camilla looked up at her mom with tears in her eyes, and she told her mom that actually her head hurt so much that she wasn't hungry. And then suddenly Camilla was sobbing, saying that she wished her head didn't hurt all the time. While her relatives filled their plates, Gabriela squatted down next to her daughter and wiped the tears away from her cheeks. For the last few months, Camilla had been complaining that she had a headache almost every single day. At first, the pain did not seem that bad, so Gabriela figured her daughter was just tired or maybe dehydrated from playing so hard, and so Gabriela had just given her daughter water and over-the-counter medicine, and Camilla did seem to get better. But in the last few days, Camilla's headaches had gotten so bad that they were making her cry like this, and now she wouldn't even eat because of her headache. Gabriela turned around to her extended family and explained what was going on with her daughter. She said she had to take Camilla to the hospital to get her headaches checked out. Camilla's grandmother insisted on going with them, and that meant that all the cousins would be coming too. So all the family pushed their food aside, and they all packed into Gabriela's car and headed towards Boston Children's Hospital. About half an hour later, Gabriela helped her little daughter onto a bed inside of the pediatric emergency room. The walls of the room they were in were painted with all these colorful images from popular children's books, but the cheerful decor did not seem to make Camilla feel any less miserable. The only thing that helped her was the fact that her dad, Joel, had shown up at the hospital too. Gabriella had called him at work, and he had left early to come be with the family. Little Camilla sat with her father, Joel, on the hospital bed and leaned her head on his shoulder, while a nurse brought in extra chairs for the large family. Gabriella had already told the nurse about Camilla's headache symptoms, and now they were waiting for an ER doctor to come examine her. A few minutes later, a tall, thin man in a white coat entered the room and shook hands with Camilla's entire family. He introduced himself as Dr. Arthur Patton and then turned to Gabriella and asked her to tell him about her daughter. Gabriella said that normally Camilla was the super high-energy kid. She wasn't in school yet, but she was very bright, and Gabriella and Joel read her books almost every night before bed. Camilla was also very close with her entire extended family. She actually stayed with her grandmother Maria in the Bronx in New York every other month, and then stayed with her parents the rest of the time. Maria was still in her 40s, and she was virtually co-parenting Camilla as well as her cousins in New York, which was a tall order. All the kids were young and totally rambunctious, except for little Camilla, ever since she developed these headaches. Gabriella explained that Camilla's pain seemed minor at first, but it had gotten worse over time. Camilla said it felt like somebody was squeezing her head really hard, and that where it hurt most was behind her forehead and eyes. Gabriella said that it appeared like the pain seemed to fade whenever Camilla was busy, but it never really went away. Dr. Patton nodded and asked Gabriella if her daughter had any other symptoms that concerned her. Gabriella said that actually yes, recently, in addition to these headaches, her daughter had seemed clumsier than normal. She would bump into things as if she wasn't seeing them, and once when she was eating, it was like she couldn't figure out how to use her fork during dinner, which totally didn't make sense. But Gabriella admitted that, perhaps her daughter was kind of teasing her with the silverware thing, but she really couldn't be sure. Dr. Patton made a note of this. Then he asked if little Camilla took any regular medications, and her mother said no. Sometimes she gave her daughter over-the-counter pain medicine, but that was it. Dr. Patton nodded. He said headaches were common and usually went away on their own. But the fact that Camilla's pain had lasted so long and become so severe was concerning. Plus, her clumsiness could be a sign of a neurological problem. Gabriella's stomach twisted with anxiety, and she started worrying that she had waited too long to bring Camilla to a doctor. She knew she must have looked terrified because Dr. Patton quickly assured her that little Camilla was almost certainly fine. They just needed to perform a quick physical examination to make sure. Camilla's father, Joel, helped Camilla sit upright while the doctor checked her vital signs. He tested her pulse, blood pressure, and temperature, and felt along her scalp and temples for sore spots. After that, he shined a small light into her eyes to make sure her pupils dilated correctly, and then Dr. Patton stepped back and told the parents that their daughter seemed normal. But Camilla was obviously in a lot of pain, and so the doctor said he didn't want to send her home quite yet without making absolutely sure she was okay. So the doctor offered to call in the hospital's neurology fellow, who had just finished his medical training, for a second opinion. Gabriella eagerly nodded. She still felt nervous, but she was thankful that Dr. Patton was doing everything he could to help their daughter. About 30 minutes later, a well-known pediatric neurologist named Dr. David Urian entered Camilla's hospital room. Dr. Urian was an old, kindly man with gray hair, glasses, and a bow tie, and he had been at his office at nearby Harvard Medical School when the neurology fellow had called him and said they had this puzzling case at Children's Hospital. There was a 5-year-old girl suffering from chronic headaches, clumsiness, and confusion, but her physical and neurological exams both looked normal. The fellow had asked Dr. Urian to come over and see if he could figure out what was going on with her. And so now, Dr. Urian saw Camilla's mother, father, and extended family standing around Camilla's bed, watching her anxiously. Dr. Urian introduced himself and said hello, and Camilla's relatives nodded and waved, but the little girl herself didn't even acknowledge him. She just stared down at her feet, looking scared and uncomfortable. The neurology fellow, who was very clean-cut and looked to be about 30 years old, handed Dr. Urian a copy of Camilla's medical charts and briefed the older doctor on what they knew so far. Dr. Urian said he wanted to start by doing another neurological exam. The fellow stayed in the room to observe while Dr. Urian went to Camilla's bedside. Now that he was standing over her, Camilla looked up at him and blinked several times. The doctor asked her for her name and birthday, and she answered both questions correctly. Next, Dr. Urian asked Camilla to push with her arms and legs against his hands, and when she did, she seemed strong. Then he asked her to walk around the room, and she didn't have any problems balancing. When she sat back down, he told her to close her eyes. Then, he touched a tuning fork to her arms and legs and asked her to tell him where she felt the cold metal. Again, Camilla answered correctly. Finally, Dr. Urian shined a small flashlight into the girl's eyes, and her pupils dilated normally, just like Dr. Patton had seen earlier. However, the neurologist wasn't actually looking at Camilla's pupils. He was looking behind them, into the very back of her eye, at an area called the retina. Dr. Urian carefully examined the tiny blood vessels in Camilla's retinas. Normally, the blood vessels deep inside of a person's eyes pulsate at the same rate as their heartbeat, but Camilla's were not pulsating at all. Dr. Urian had only seen this a few times before, but he knew retinal veins stop pulsating when a patient has an unusually high amount of pressure inside of their skull, often from some kind of an injury. To him, this was an obvious sign that Camilla was not suffering from typical headaches. More likely, she was in agony because she had suffered a serious head injury at some point and had brain swelling or bleeding, or possibly she could even have a brain tumor. Dr. Urian didn't want to alarm Camilla's family, so he quietly excused himself and asked the neurology fellow to join him in the hall. And once they were out there, Dr. Urian quietly explained what he had seen inside of the girl's eyes. Then Dr. Urian went back into the room and told Camilla's family that he wanted to get a better idea of what was happening in Camilla's head by performing what's called a CT scan, which is a type of X-ray that creates detailed pictures of a patient's internal organs. Camilla's mother, Gabriella, looked very nervous and overwhelmed, but she said okay, and so Dr. Urian called the radiology department to order the scan. Less than half an hour later, Camilla's CT scan was finished, and Dr. Urian strode down a hallway, test results in hand. He had reviewed the black and white images of Camilla's brain, and he didn't see any evidence of swelling, bleeding, or a tumor, which was a good sign. But he didn't know how to square these results with what he saw inside of the girl's eyes. Dr. Urian feared that Camilla had a neurological problem that didn't show up on the CT scan. He knew CT scans didn't capture literally everything, and it was possible Camilla had some kind of hidden tumor or abnormality that was causing these symptoms. But Dr. Urian also knew that brain tumors in 5-year-olds were incredibly rare, and so there was no reason to make Camilla's family panic until he had a more definitive diagnosis. So he planned to choose his words very carefully. Then he turned a corner in the hallway and opened the door to Camilla's room to speak with her family. When Gabriella heard the door open, she was sitting on the bed with Camilla's head in her lap. She watched her daughter blink at the sound of the door opening. Then Gabriella looked up at Dr. Urian and forced herself to smile, hoping her daughter would not see how truly afraid she actually was. Dr. Urian told Camilla's family that her CT scan results appeared normal. And right away, Gabriella immediately felt relief wash over her. Her forced smile suddenly became genuine. But Joel was not smiling, and neither was Camilla's grandmother, Maria. Maria asked the doctor what this meant for her granddaughter. If Camilla's CT scan was normal, then why did she keep getting these headaches? Like, what was going on here? Dr. Urian admitted that he was still trying to figure that out. He said he wanted to do another type of scan called an MRI with contrast. This was a much more advanced imaging technique than the CT scan, and it required doctors to inject Camilla with a special dye to make the image of her brain sharper and easier to read. The procedure could also be tricky for kids. Camilla would have to lie very still inside of a long tube-shaped machine that made a lot of loud noises. When she heard this, Gabriella suddenly was scared again. She felt like there might be something the neurologist wasn't telling her. Otherwise, why would he keep making her daughter undergo more tests? But Gabriella did not argue. She just said okay, and she watched the doctor leave the room. Then Gabriella looked down at her daughter's head in her lap, looking so small and so vulnerable. She gently brushed Camilla's long dark hair behind her ear and wondered what doctors could be looking for inside of her head. About an hour later, Dr. Urian and a whole medical team huddled around a computer screen in the radiology department to examine the results of Camilla's MRI with contrast. One doctor used a mouse to adjust the brightness and contrast of the image, and as the picture became clearer, Dr. Urian noticed something odd. Camilla's optic nerves, which connected her eyes to her brain, looked strangely bright, almost like they were painted to glow in the dark. Dr. Urian had never seen anything like this before, and he asked his team if any of them knew what this meant, and all of them shook their heads no. This was totally weird to them too. Unsure what else to do, the neurologist called the hospital's eye doctor, who told Dr. Urian to send Camilla right over for an exam. Just a few minutes after Camilla's eye exam, Dr. Urian, who was still in the radiology department looking over Camilla's MRI results, got a call back from the hospital's eye doctor. And he said something truly shocking. Camilla was almost totally blind. She had practically no vision at all in her right eye, and her left eye wasn't much better. Dr. Urian was speechless. Camilla had never said a word to her mother, her father, or grandmother about not being able to see. But the eye doctor told him that was actually pretty normal. Children Camilla's age often don't voice concerns about their vision because the way they see the world is kind of what's normal to them. They don't really know how they're supposed to see things yet. Dr. Urian thanked the doctor and hung up. He looked back at Camilla's MRI results, which now made a little more sense. Her optic nerves had somehow gotten damaged, and that's why they looked so strange on the MRI. Camilla was not gradually becoming clumsy and confused because of a brain tumor. The child literally couldn't see. But all of this didn't explain why Camilla had lost her vision or how they could preserve the eyesight she still had. Clearly, pressure had to be building up in Camilla's skull, Dr. Urian thought, but from what? If it wasn't due to bleeding, swelling, or a tumor, maybe it was from an infection. And so now, Dr. Urian wanted to do one more test, and he already knew Camilla and her whole family were not going to like it. Later that afternoon, Gabriella sat next to Joel and Camilla on the hospital bed. They'd been in the ER for hours. Camilla's cousins were all bored and tired, and Maria just flipped kind of mindlessly through TV channels, hoping to find something to keep the kids entertained. Meanwhile, Camilla's headaches were relentless. After her eye exam, she'd come back into the room and laid down with her eyes shut, and she'd barely moved since. Just then, Gabriella heard a knock at the door, and Dr. Urian came inside. He said he had some surprising news. The results from Camilla's eye exam showed that she was almost completely blind. Gabriella just stared at the doctor in shock. She thought back to the evening when Camilla couldn't figure out how to use her fork, and she realized her daughter wasn't playing games. She really could not see the food on her plate. All those times Camilla had seemed confused or bumped into things, it was because the whole world looked blurry to her. Gabriella couldn't believe she'd missed something that now seemed so obvious. She looked over at Joel, who seemed just as dumbfounded. But before Gabriella or Joel or Maria could ask any questions, Dr. Urian said he wanted to perform yet another test to figure out what was causing the girl's blindness. He said Camilla needed to undergo something called a spinal tap, which is a procedure where doctors insert a needle into the patient's spine and remove the sample of cerebrospinal fluid. Analyzing this fluid can help doctors diagnose brain infections. But at this point, Gabriella was starting to feel like her daughter was turning into a human pincushion. Camilla had already had a physical exam, 2 neurological exams, an eye exam, a CT scan, and an MRI with contrast. Now, Dr. Urian wanted to jab a needle into her daughter's spine? Gabriella wondered if this was too much for her daughter. But Dr. Urian promised the procedure might be scary sounding, but it was safe. Plus, it was necessary, because he still hadn't determined the cause of Camilla's terrible headaches, let alone her vision loss. Gabriella took a deep breath and said, "Okay, fine," as Joel wrapped an arm around her shoulders for support. A few minutes later, a different doctor came into the room to perform the spinal tap. He instructed Camilla to lie sideways on the bed and curl up into a ball. Gabriella held her daughter's hand tightly as the doctor cleaned Camilla's lower back and gave her a numbing shot. Then the doctor inserted a long, thin needle into Camilla's spine. The needle was attached to a syringe, and as the doctor pulled the stopper backwards, the syringe slowly filled with clear fluid. The doctor removed the needle, placed a bandage on Camilla's back, and said they would send her spinal fluid to the lab for analysis right away. Then the doctor left the room, and Gabriella loosened her grip on her daughter's hand. About 45 minutes later, Dr. Urian was in his office when he received the results of Camilla's spinal tap. There was no unusual bacteria in her spinal fluid, which ruled out the possibility of a brain infection. But the results also showed that the pressure inside of her head and spinal column was dangerously high, 2.5 times the normal level. This confirmed what Dr. Urian had already concluded, but he still didn't know where the pressure was coming from. All he knew was that there was no evidence of the usual causes of brain swelling. And yet the pressure inside of Camilla's head was so high that it had damaged her optic nerves and caused her to lose her vision. And as Dr. Urian thought this over, he suddenly remembered that there was actually a name for this condition. It was called a pseudotumor cerebri. This meant Camilla had many of the symptoms associated with a brain tumor, but didn't actually have a tumor. This condition was so rare, especially in children, that Dr. Urian had not even considered it until just now. Dr. Urian rushed back to Camilla's hospital room and told her family about her diagnosis. He said pseudotumors can be caused by a variety of things, and he needed their help to figure out what caused this one in Camilla. The neurologist asked the family again if she took any medications or if there was any way she could have taken somebody else's medication by accident. Camilla's mother, father, and grandmother all said no, there was no way. Dr. Urian didn't want to offend Camilla's guardians by continuing to press them, so he printed out a list of all the possible causes of Camilla's condition and gave it to her family. Her mother, father, and grandmother quickly began to look over this list, and before long, the doctor noticed Camilla's grandmother, Maria, her expression completely changed. Her eyes widened as she stared at the sheet, and then she looked up at him in a total panic. Maria said she might know what made Camilla sick, but she would have to go all the way home to the Bronx to get it. While Maria traveled to and from New York, Joel took his nieces and nephews back to his and Gabriella's small apartment, and Gabriella stayed with their daughter at the hospital. Dr. Urian kept an eye on Camilla and worked to try to reduce the pressure inside of her head by draining more fluid from her spine and giving her special medications. And little by little, Camilla did start feeling better. The next day, Maria returned from the Bronx, and she sheepishly handed Dr. Urian a small bottle. She said her granddaughter's illness was definitely all her fault. Then the doctor read the label on the bottle she handed him, and all of Camilla's symptoms suddenly made sense. The bottle that Maria gave the doctor contained fish oil supplements, which are rich in omega-3 fatty acids, as well as vitamins A and D. Maria took these supplements religiously. She believed they strengthened her heart and also reduced her pain from arthritis. And when Camilla stayed with her grandmother in the Bronx every other month, Maria gave her 1 pill a day too. But when Dr. Urian looked at the bottle, he realized these fish oil pills were not formulated for kids. They were made for adults. So every time Camilla took one, she was getting 3 times the recommended dose of vitamin A for a child her age. That much vitamin A can wreak havoc on a young person's body and lead to irreversible organ damage. And in this case, it caused pressure to build up inside of Camilla's head, which then caused her to lose her vision and develop constant, debilitating headaches. Obviously, from this point forward, nobody in this family gave Camilla any more fish oil, which halted any further damage to Camilla's eyesight and nervous system. And while Camilla did luckily regain some of her vision, her eyesight was, unfortunately, permanently altered. She's now able to live a relatively normal life with the help of glasses and contact lenses, but she still does get the occasional headache. On the morning of February 4th, 1991, a taxicab driver named Wang was chatting with the taxi dispatcher at headquarters when suddenly, for no clear reason, the dispatcher stopped talking to Wang and just began staring intently at something behind Wang. And so Wang noticed this, and right away he turned around to see what it was he was looking at, but all Wang could see was just a window that looked out to this huge fenced-in parking lot that was full of taxicabs and their drivers. This is where they would go to wait for fares. And where the taxi headquarters were located was right near the airport in a very busy city called Kaohsiung City in Taiwan, and so taxi cabs in this area were really in high demand. And so as Wang looked out at the very busy parking lot full of drivers talking to potential customers, to Wang, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just a typical busy day. But when Wang kind of looked at the dispatcher like, I don't really see what you see, the dispatcher just raised his finger and kind of pointed in the direction that he was staring. And so Wang turned around again, and this time, when he looked in the direction the dispatcher was pointing, he could see immediately why the dispatcher was reacting the way he was. because the dispatcher was pointing at one of their colleagues, so another taxi driver, whose name was Leo Shui Chung, and as Wang looked out at him, he saw Leo was sprinting across this very busy parking lot full of all these cabs and drivers and customers, and Leo was clutching this big golden statue of Buddha in his arms as he ran. And so Wang and the dispatcher watched Leo, and what he did is he kept running all the way across the lot until he got to his taxi cab, at which point he practically dove inside of it, he slammed the door, locked every door, and then began looking around frantically like he was expecting someone to show up who had been chasing him or something. But there was nobody around his car, and Wang and the dispatcher kind of scanned the parking lot, and they didn't see anybody who seemed remotely interested in Leo. And so Wang and the dispatcher continued to watch Leo from the window, and they saw eventually Leo stopped kind of scanning around for other people, and at that point he took that golden statue of Buddha and he placed it up on the dash of his cab. And this was not the first Buddha statue that he had put up there. From Wang and the dispatcher's perspective, it looked like he had at least 2 or 3 that were right up there alongside this new one. And then after Leo placed this new golden statue, he sort of sat back in his chair, and from Wang and the dispatcher's perspective, it sort of looked like he had closed his eyes and was praying or mumbling something, but, whatever he was doing, it just seemed kind of odd. And so eventually, Wang and the dispatcher stopped watching Leo, who still just continued to sit back in his chair and, mumble or pray or something. And then Wang and the dispatcher looked at each other and they exchanged very concerned looks. Because they both knew, Leo was kind of a weird guy, but from his behavior today, it just seemed like, something must be wrong with Leo. There has to be some issue. So, for context, Leo was this 35-year-old guy who lived alone, and he had this reputation of being very antisocial and kind of just rude, like he had terrible manners. But recently, Wang and the dispatcher and other taxi drivers who worked at this company had noticed that Leo's behavior had gone from being kind of awkward and antisocial to being kind of menacing. Like not even including the weird behavior he was exhibiting now, just like in his day-to-day interactions with people, he was just really aggressive. Like, he always would tell his colleagues at the taxi company how much he hated stray cats and dogs. And, a lot of people found these stray cats and dogs in their neighborhood in the city to be a bit of a nuisance. They'd rummage through trash and make noise or whatever, but nobody really paid them much attention. They were just stray animals trying to survive. Like, it wasn't a big deal. But for Leo, he obsessed over hating the stray cats and dogs and how much he wanted them to get out of his neighborhood. And somewhat recently, he had come to work and told his colleagues that he had gone out and gotten a crossbow, and at night he'd begun shooting at the stray cats and dogs, which totally horrified his colleagues. And now Leo had this weird thing going on with his Buddha statues that he was putting inside of his cab. And also, in addition to those statues, he had begun putting on the windows inside of his cab these things called fulus, which are these little strips of yellow parchment paper that basically ward off evil spirits. And so Leo had basically transformed the interior of his cab into this sort of weird shrine or temple. And in fact, Leo had put up so many of these fulus on the inside of the windows, and again, all those statues that sat on the dash, that when he drove, he could barely see because his view was totally obstructed. But despite everybody at the company seeing this totally weird behavior playing out with Leo, nobody went up to him and said, "Hey, what are you doing with these statues and pieces of paper? What's going on here?" Because nobody wanted to interact with him. He seemed like kind of a menace, and so people just kind of let him do his thing. But now, as Wang and the dispatcher are watching Leo run across the lot and act totally psychotic, they looked at each other and they were like, maybe we should do something. And so Wang volunteered to call the police, and as Wang turned to go walk out and make the call, he saw Leo peeling out of the parking lot, nearly smashing into cars and people, just driving like a total maniac. And so Leo really felt like, okay, yeah, this really is the time to step in. Someone's going to get hurt here. The following day, Wang would contact his friend in the police department, and he would explain what was going on with Leo. And to Wang's surprise, his friend told him that actually, the police were well aware of Leo. And that was because, not all that long ago, Leo was actually a suspect in a murder case. So about 10 months earlier, in April of 1990, a 23-year-old woman from Japan named Mariko Iguchi had visited Taiwan on vacation, and during this vacation, she had gone missing. Now, at the time, the Taiwanese economy really relied heavily on Japanese tourism, and so Taiwan really aggressively marketed to Japan to, come visit, come on vacation here. And so it was pretty common for Japanese college students to visit Taiwan on vacation to celebrate things like a graduation or a birthday party, and so that's what Mariko was doing. She was here celebrating, and she was traveling alone. Also, one sort of quirky thing about Taiwanese culture at the time was it was pretty common for taxicab drivers to open up their own personal homes to their fares, basically saying, hey, don't stay at a hotel, I'll give you a ride wherever you're gonna go, but then at night, you can stay at my house with my family. And so it was just kind of a thing in Taiwan that people visited and stayed at the homes of their taxicab drivers. So when Mariko came to Taiwan on this vacation, this is what she did. She stayed in the home of the taxicab driver, and it was during this period of time that she went missing. And so naturally, when the investigation began into her disappearance, the first place police went were the taxicab drivers. And so first, the police focused on a driver in the capital of Taiwan who said he had given Mariko a few rides, he had brought her sightseeing, and then he had let her stay in his home. But he said, after that, she left and he didn't see her again. He had no idea what happened to her. And the police would actually discover that after Mariko left that particular driver's house, she would send a postcard to her family that was dated after she had left. And so basically this ruled out the first driver as a suspect. And so for a little while, this case went cold because the police couldn't find any other taxicab drivers that had given Mariko a ride. But then, a few months later, the police offered a reward for information about what happened to Mariko, and it was then that police got a tip that Mariko had been seen speaking to Leo at the train station before she disappeared. But when police spoke to Leo, he immediately said, yes, I did give Mariko a ride, but that was it. She didn't stay at my house. It was just this one ride from the train station into town, and after she got out, I have no idea what happened to her. And so police would ask Leo dozens more questions and they would try to get more information from him, but he just didn't have any. And then at the same time, there was this flood of all these new tips that began coming into the police station about this case. But it would turn out a lot of these leads, like all of them, were just terrible tips. People were calling in totally random stuff just because now there was this monetary reward for information, and it was kind of incentivizing people to just call in anything, and it was actually making the investigation much harder because now the police had all these bad tips, and so they really weren't getting anywhere. But despite the slow progress the police were making in this case had really been elevated and become like a huge international news story, and lots of people all over the world were following it. And during this time, when all these people are tuned in to this case, really weird things began happening surrounding this case. People in the city began receiving all these strange phone calls from this kind of frantic woman speaking Japanese. And in Taiwan, people predominantly speak Taiwanese and Mandarin, not Japanese. So this is a weird phone call to be getting in Taiwan. And also, at this time, you need to remember that Mariko's disappearance was kind of all over the news. And so to get these weird calls from a woman speaking Japanese who sounds totally frantic, it made people in the city believe that it was Mariko placing these strange phone calls. But these calls, they didn't make any sense. It was just a woman kind of yelling in Japanese, and then she would just abruptly hang up. And also, there were all these reports of people claiming to have seen Mariko or heard Mariko just in the city walking around. None of it was substantiated, but there was just kind of this eerie quality to the case. And so when Wang called his friend at the police department to report Leo for his totally weird behavior, this was at a time when the Mariko missing person case was still totally front of mind in Taiwan and around the world, and also the police were still actively investigating this case, and frankly, Leo had not been ruled out as a suspect in this case. He was not considered a primary suspect by any means, but he wasn't ruled out yet. And so the police are hearing that Leo's acting really funny, and it made them think, hey, maybe we should reinvestigate this guy and see if he really is connected to the Mariko missing person case. And so ultimately, after Wang hung up, his friend in the police department got in touch with the lead detective on the Mariko case and told him about what was going on with Leo. And this lead detective, whose name was Lin Xiaoji, decided he would just put Leo under surveillance to see what he was doing. Starting sometime in the middle of February of 1991, Detective Lin and a few of his colleagues began taking turns trailing Leo basically 24/7. And so the police just kept their distance and they followed Leo all around the city as he picked up his fares. And, the police never got out to talk to any of the fares, to get insights into whatever Leo might have been saying inside the cab. They just kind of watched from a distance and just wanted to see if there was any obvious red flags. Detective Lin figured, if Leo was somehow involved in whatever happened to Mariko, let's say she was killed, and let's say Leo was responsible for killing her, maybe if they followed Leo long enough, he might drive to an area that was kind of connected to her murder. Maybe her gravesite or the place where he killed her or something. Going to kind of strange random locations without a fare would likely be an indication to police that that was a place of interest. But as the police tailed Leo, that's not what he did. Leo basically never ever left his cab. Leo basically just picked up a passenger, drove them where they needed to go, and then repeated over and over and over again all day long. And then at the end of the night, instead of going home to his apartment that police knew he had, he would just sleep inside of his cab, just like in parking lots and stuff. And the only times he would go into his apartment appeared to be just so he could go to the bathroom or maybe shower or something because they would see him through the window. But whenever Leo went into his apartment, he went through the same totally weird ritual every time. He would be in his cab, parked out front of his apartment, and the police are, parked far enough away that they can watch this. And Leo, at some point, would begin kind of frantically looking all around him, as if he was looking for somebody who was trying to hurt him or who was spying on him or something. And then after kind of making sure the coast was clear, Leo would open up his door and sprint, like absolutely as fast as he could, into his apartment building, and he'd only be in there for like a couple of minutes before he'd come bombing back out and practically dive into his cab, and he would shut all the doors, lock all the doors, and then, he'd clutch his golden statues and he'd rub his fulus that were taped all over the inside of his cab, and he'd continue frantically looking around, to make sure nobody was there to hurt him or something. And then after a little while, he'd kind of calm down, he'd put his statue back on the dash, he'd kind of make sure his fulus were all in place, and then he would drive away. So, of course, Leo's behavior, from the police's perspective, was totally bizarre, but in Detective Lin's mind, it didn't really seem like the behavior of a murderer. It seemed more like the behavior of someone who had lost their mind. Finally, on March 4th, 1991, Detective Lin decided that he just needed to speak to Leo, which required, basically ambushing Leo. So Detective Lin coordinated with his officers who were out surveilling Leo, and he had them tell him when Leo was at his apartment, going in to use the bathroom. And when they called in to Detective Lin that, hey, he just got to his apartment, he's about to run inside, Detective Lin and some other officers raced to the apartment, and they were all ready outside for whenever Leo came running back out to dive back into his cab. They were going to intercept him. And now Detective Lin and his colleagues didn't really know how Leo was going to react to having all these police standing there ready to grab him. I mean, was this guy going to be hostile? Was he going to be aggressive? Was he going to be scared, sad? They had no idea. It just seemed like Leo was totally unstable, so they all kind of had to be ready for whatever reaction he was going to have. However, the way Leo ultimately reacted to this was not the way any of the officers suspected. When Leo came bombing out of his apartment after a very short bathroom break, he began charging down the stairs towards his cab, and then seemed to kind of realize there were all these detectives and police officers all standing in front of him, literally getting ready to grab him, and Leo just collapsed to his knees and began sobbing and thanking them over and over and over again. Now, Detective Lin had no idea what this was. He didn't really understand what Leo was thanking them for, but he didn't waste any time trying to figure out what was going on. Instead, Detective Lin just went up to Leo and said, hey, we need to speak to you at the station. Will you come with us? And Leo was like, of course I will. Of course I will. And so Detective Lin drove Leo to the police station, and when they got there, Leo was saying things like, oh, I wish I could just stay at the police station with you all. Like, this is where I'm safe. I want to stay here. Now, Lin didn't really respond to this. He just kind of said, okay, yeah. And then they went inside together to head towards the interview room. And as they're walking there, Leo was saying over and over again to Detective Lin and any of the officers he passes by, thank you so much. You're my savior. Thank you. Now, the police had no idea why Liao was treating them like his saviors, because to them, they're like, dude, we just ambushed you and brought you to the police station to question you about potentially being involved in a murder, so I don't know how we saved you. But it would turn out Liao had a really compelling reason to believe they really had just saved him. Because it would turn out Liao had this absolutely terrifying thing happening inside of his apartment. Just several minutes earlier, when Liao had run into his apartment, so right before he charged back outside and police grabbed him and took him to the station, when he was still inside of his apartment, he stepped inside and the apartment was totally dark. All the lights are off, all the shades are drawn, and immediately Liao felt his heart starting to race. And he looked around his apartment and it was totally silent, but then he heard it. He could hear on the far side of his apartment, in a room that he couldn't quite see into, the sound of breathing. But Liao lives alone. There shouldn't be anybody here. He has no pets, there's nobody here, but he hears breathing in another room. But Liao knew there was nothing he could do. The only thing he could do was just try to get in there, go to the bathroom, and get out as quickly as possible. And so very slowly, Liao began kind of tiptoeing across the living room floor, kind of making sure to stay out of eyesight of the doorway that led into the room where the breathing was coming from. And as soon as he kind of got past an area where he could be seen from the doorway, he ran the rest of the way down the hallway. He cut into the bathroom and shut the door and locked it. And then as quickly as he could, he did his business. He used a washcloth to clean himself because he didn't have time to take a shower because of what was going on inside of his apartment. And then once he was all done, he took a deep breath, and then he opened up the door. And this time, the apartment was absolutely silent. There was no more breathing. And so Liao, thinking he had this opportunity to get out of here without being caught by this thing inside of his apartment, he turned and just started running towards the door. And as soon as he did, he began to hear a voice, a hoarse female voice, screaming at him from the other side of his apartment, screeching, "Why? Why? Why?" And as Liao is just about to get to the door, he turns and he sees Mariko, the missing woman, running with her hair all knotted and matted hanging over her face, sprinting towards him from that back room. And Liao, he only managed to barely get out of his apartment and shut it and lock it before she ran into the door. And then it went silent again. This is why Liao was acting totally crazy, because he was terrified of what he believed was like this demonic entity inside of his apartment. He didn't think that was a real person. He thought it was like the spirit of Mariko or something, and she was haunting him. And so he had no idea what to do, he didn't know who to tell, and he just began living out of his cab instead of dealing with whatever was going on in his apartment. And so when Liao charged outside after this latest encounter with Mariko, he sees the police, and Liao is just overwhelmed with relief. Hopefully, he's thinking they can get rid of her and his life can go back to normal. But as overjoyed as Liao appeared to be, and now having the police on his side, finally being able to deal with whatever was going on, when push came to shove, Liao actually did not feel comfortable immediately giving up details of whatever was going on with Mariko inside of his apartment. But as Liao was brought by Detective Lin to the police station to tell them what was going on with how Mariko was in his apartment and she was haunting him, it seemed like it was the ghost of her or something. As Liao was having that conversation, other police officers were sent to Liao's apartment to go see if maybe Mariko really was in his apartment. Maybe that's where she had been this whole time. Maybe she broke into this guy's apartment and was just squatting there and harassing him, and that was the mystery. That's where she's been. But when police went into Liao's apartment, there was no sign whatsoever that anybody else besides Liao was living in that apartment. There was no sign of a break-in. There was nothing. It was just Liao's apartment. And so this made police really suspicious of Liao because his story was so outrageous, and also he's talking about a person who's actively missing, Mariko. And so the police really pressured Liao to, come forward, give us more information. Why did you say this is Mariko in your apartment? Because there's nobody in your apartment. Tell us what's going on here. And so finally, after 4 days of intense questioning of Liao did finally admit to police that there was more to this story. It would turn out Liao really did pick Mariko up at the train station when she arrived in Taiwan for her vacation, so he did give her a ride just like he said he had. But Liao had lied about what happened after that. It would turn out, after giving her this ride, Liao stayed with Mariko and they went sightseeing together, and then Liao invited Mariko to stay with him at his apartment, which again was customary in Taiwan. And so Mariko said yes, and she went to his apartment in the evening, and while they were there, Liao did proposition Mariko, and she rejected him. And at first, Liao just let it go, but then after Mariko fell asleep that night, he got his crossbow that he used to shoot dogs and cats, and he went into her room and he shot her 4 times with the crossbow and then cut her head off. Liao would bury her body the following night, but that same night was the first time Liao began hearing the breathing in his apartment. He couldn't quite place it, and then not long after that, the head of Mariko, the severed head, would chase him all around his apartment, screaming, why, at him. And so basically, Mariko's severed head began haunting Liao incessantly to the point where he moved into his taxi cab and put up all those fulu papers to protect him from evil spirits, and also put up all those statues of Buddha for the same reason. I mean, he was living in his cab to protect himself from what he believed was this evil spirit. And so when people saw Liao in his cab kind of sitting back and muttering to himself, that was him praying that he would live through whatever was going on with this head. Liao would tell police where he buried Mariko's body, and he would tell police he buried her entire body in one location, including her head. But when police dug her up, it was only her lower half. Her head was missing. Liao was convicted of murder, and to this day, he is still in prison. Many people in Taiwan believe that, this case was ultimately solved because of Mariko's spirit, that she played a big role. Her head haunting Liao is what drove him crazy to the point where he admitted to police what he did. And then also, people in Taiwan think all those strange phone calls they were getting from that woman who was speaking Japanese and acting frantic and then hanging up, they say that was Mariko's spirit too, that was maybe one of her attempts just to keep people engaged with the story so that it wouldn't fade and become a cold case. And in fact, even some of the police, including Detective Lin, say they do believe Mariko's spirit played a role. And in fact, Detective Lin said at one point when he was inside of Liao's apartment, he was by himself and he felt someone push him on the back. And when he turned around, there was nobody there. And so he was convinced that Mariko's spirit was inhabiting that apartment. On May 27, 2022, an anesthesiologist named Dr. Chad Marsden stood inside of an operating room with a nurse, a surgeon, and their unconscious patient. Dr. Marsden worked at the Baylor Scott & White Surgicare Center in Dallas, Texas, and it was his job to make sure patients stayed asleep during surgery and then woke up safely afterward. That day, Dr. Marsden and his colleagues were wrapping up a routine liposuction procedure on a middle-aged woman. The surgeon had just finished stitching up the woman's incisions, and so Dr. Marsden, following protocol, began taking her slowly off of anesthesia to wake her back up again. And so Dr. Marsden turned off the anesthesia machine, which is this big rectangular device that takes the liquid anesthesia drugs and converts it into a vapor so it can be breathed in. And then Dr. Marsden removed the breathing mask from the woman's face. Then he changed her IV from an anesthetic drug mixture to regular saline. And so now that these drugs were not being pumped into her system, she would wake up over the next half hour or so. After that, Dr. Marsden and the nurse and the surgeon took their patient on the stretcher, and they pushed her out of the OR into the hallway and began making their way down towards the recovery room. But as they were walking down this hallway, they bumped into more of their colleagues, another nurse and another anesthesiologist, and the hallway was tight enough that Dr. Marsden had to step aside to let these two pass. And then after they did, and they sort of waved at their colleagues, Marsden, the nurse, and the surgeon continued walking. And as they did, Marsden happened to look down at their patient, and immediately he knew something was wrong. This woman's skin had turned completely gray. Dr. Marsden was totally caught off guard by this. He looked at her vital sign monitor and saw that her blood pressure, which just moments ago had been normal, was now dangerously high,
And then as he's staring at her monitor, her blood pressure plummeted. And then also her oxygen levels fell, and then she began foaming at the mouth. It was clear this woman was going into cardiac arrest, which meant if they didn't act quickly, her heart was going to stop. Now, Dr. Marsden, again, is sort of in shock at how quickly this is happening, but he just jumped into protocol. He began giving the woman chest compressions to make sure blood was flowing to her heart. Meanwhile, the surgeon administered oxygen and blood pressure medication, and the nurse called for an ambulance. The reason she had to call for an ambulance is because the Surgicare Center was not equipped to handle medical emergencies. It was only for scheduled surgeries. And so if there was a medical emergency, all they could do was just stabilize the patient until paramedics arrived. And that's exactly what Dr. Marsden, the nurse, and the surgeon did. They got this woman stable, and then just a minute later, 2 paramedics came running down the hallway. They took possession of the patient, they put her onto their stretcher, out the door they went, they put her in the back of the ambulance, and they sped off to the local hospital. As Dr. Marsden watched the ambulance disappear down the road, he knew his patient was now in good hands, but he was still very shaken by the whole experience. Because this type of emergency, somebody going into unexplained sudden cardiac arrest following a totally routine surgery, was extremely rare. Meaning, for this to happen even just once over the course of somebody's medical career, to have witnessed something like that, was very rare. But for Dr. Marsden, this was not the first time he had seen this. In fact, literally the day before, a different patient at the Surgicare Center had also gone into sudden, unexplained cardiac arrest following their routine procedure. So, as Dr. Marsden went back inside and began heading upstairs to the hospital administrator's office to tell them about this latest emergency, he kept thinking to himself how crazy it was that he had just witnessed these 2 unexplained sudden cardiac arrests basically back to back. But Dr. Marsden just thought to himself, hopefully this is just a really bad coincidence. The Surgicare Center's administrator was a woman named Ashley Burks, and when she heard about this second unexplained cardiac arrest, she knew she had to call a staff meeting. And so that evening, she, along with Dr. Marsden and over 24 other medical staff, doctors, nurses, other anesthesiologists, they met in this conference room in the back of the building. And once everybody was assembled, Ashley began by updating everyone on the 2 patients who had been rushed off to the hospital for their cardiac emergencies, and she said they had stabilized and they'd be okay. But Ashley then said what everybody in the room was thinking, which is sudden unexplained cardiac arrest is so rare, we can't just treat these things like coincidence. Like something specifically must have caused these incidents, and we need to figure out what that thing was. Now, it was possible that the cause or causes behind these incidents were quite simple. Ashley said to the group, the first thing she did was she looked at the 2 patients' files to see if they had specific drug allergies or medical risk factors that might have been overlooked by staff. But when she looked at their files, neither patient had those risk factors or allergies, so that couldn't have been it. Ashley said she also looked for just a common thread between these 2 incidents. Like, were the patients doing something similar? Were they in for similar reasons? Were they in the same room? But no, they were in different operating rooms, going through different procedures with different medical teams. And so there was no obvious common thread between the 2 incidents. So Ashley said to the group that the only reasonable explanation that she could think of, at least at this point, was that perhaps the equipment in the Surgicare Center had malfunctioned. And so what she was going to do, out of an abundance of caution, was just begin testing all of the equipment in the building. And so Ashley told the group that in the meantime, while she was doing that, the rest of the staff should be extra attentive to their patients and also be on the lookout for potential problems with hospital equipment. Ashley watched the medical staff all nod their heads in agreement and begin sort of talking to each other, and then she thanked them all for being there and told them they could leave. 3 weeks later, on the afternoon of June 22nd, Ashley stood outside the OR in the hallway, looking through a cabinet that contained surgical drugs. Ashley was still trying to find a connection between those 2 sudden cardiac arrests. She'd already checked all the Surgicare Center's equipment, from the anesthesia machines to the vital sign monitors to the breathing tubes, and everything was in perfect working condition. And so now, checking these drugs inside of this cabinet was sort of like her last resort. She'd printed out a list of recent drug recalls and was now comparing that list against all of the drugs inside of this cabinet. And so one by one, she was reading a drug and checking the date on it and comparing it with her list to make sure, they were not carrying recalled drugs still. But after going through dozens and dozens of bottles, there was nothing in their cabinet that was on the recall list. So Ashley still just did not have an answer for why those 2 cardiac emergencies had happened. However, since that staff meeting 3 weeks earlier, the Surgery Care Center had not had another cardiac emergency. And so Ashley was thinking to herself, maybe, despite not knowing how this happened, these troubles are in the past. Ashley shut the drug cabinet and walked down the hallway towards the break room to grab her lunch. But the moment she walked inside, she saw a group of her colleagues sitting around a table looking very upset. In fact, some people were visibly crying. And so Ashley walked up to them and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And a nurse told her that one of their colleagues, an anesthesiologist named Dr. Melanie Kaspar, was dead. Apparently, the night before, she had had a heart attack at her home, and her husband had found her and called 911, but unfortunately, by the time paramedics arrived, she was already deceased. Ashley was shocked. She knew Dr. Kaspar, and she knew she was in great shape. She was only in her mid-50s. I mean, she did not seem like someone who might just randomly have a heart attack. But then also, Ashley began to think that she remembered hearing in the last few days that Dr. Kaspar had actually been feeling sick. And so she wondered if maybe whatever illness she was suffering from had something to do with her heart attack. Either way, as the SurgiCare administrator, it was Ashley's job to plan staff events like memorial services. And so Ashley told the group, hey, I'll get to work putting together a small ceremony for Dr. Kaspar. 5 days later, on June 27th, Ashley was sitting in front of her office computer ordering supplies for Dr. Kaspar's memorial when suddenly she heard these loud, fast footsteps out in the hall as if somebody was sprinting towards her office. And then a moment later, Ashley saw her door burst open and the anesthesiologist, Dr. Chad Marsden, was standing there, and he looked absolutely horrified, and he just said to her, "It's happening again." Ashley's stomach dropped, and she jumped up and sprinted after Dr. Marsden, and they made their way to the hallway outside of the OR. And when they got there, Ashley immediately heard the sound of that long single beep of somebody's heart monitor flatlining, and she looked over and she saw one of the doors to an operating room was open, and inside she saw a surgeon performing chest compressions on an elderly patient. And even from out in the hall, Ashley could tell this man was unconscious, his skin was gray, and he was foaming at the mouth. It was exactly like the other cardiac emergencies that had happened before. Except this time was worse, because that beep, that flatlining beep, meant that this man's heart had actually stopped. And so Ashley just stood there in horror, watching the surgeon perform these chest compressions, knowing that if that didn't work, if they couldn't get this man's heart started again, he was about to die. Just then, Ashley heard the sound of the doors leading into the OR hallway open, and these 2 paramedics came rushing inside, and right as they passed her and got to the doorway leading into where this man was basically dying, Ashley heard the sound of the flatline beep turn into regular beeping, which meant the surgeon who was doing chest compressions had managed to restart this man's heart. And so Ashley was relieved, but by no means thought they're out of the woods yet. I mean, this man clearly is going through a medical emergency here. But the paramedics got the man off the OR table, they put him on a stretcher, and they wheeled him away. And so once they were gone, Ashley, Dr. Marsden, and the surgeon who'd been doing the chest compressions, they all just looked at each other like, what is going on here? Clearly, there is something causing all these sudden cardiac arrests, but still nobody knew what it was. Ashley just stood there for a moment, feeling absolutely sick to her stomach. If it wasn't the drugs, and if it wasn't the medical equipment that caused these sudden cardiac arrests, then what was it? Well, Ashley was determined to find out. Over the next 2 months, Ashley interviewed and observed every single employee of the SurgiCare Center to make sure they really were following their protocol absolutely to a T. And one after another, through her research, she discovered that they all were. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. So the cardiac arrests could not be chalked up to faulty equipment, recalled drugs, or human error. And yet, the cardiac emergencies kept on happening at the SurgiCare Center. There were 3 incidents in July and 4 more incidents in the first 3 weeks of August. And so in total, that made 10 patients at the SurgiCare Center who had all gone into sudden unexplained cardiac arrest. Now, none of them had died, but Ashley knew a few of them had been left with permanent heart damage. People were getting seriously injured on her watch. And she felt like, she can't figure out what's going on here. And so it's just a matter of time until somebody does die from one of these cardiac emergencies. And so she was feeling completely overwhelmed and stressed out and desperate until August 24th, when two things happened in quick succession. First, in the morning of August 24th, Ashley received a phone call from an officer at the Dallas Police Department, and they told her that the autopsy had been completed on Dr. Melanie Kaspar, the anesthesiologist who had died back in June from a heart attack at her home. And this police officer thought that Ashley really needed to know that her heart attack had not been natural. It was actually caused by an overdose of a drug called bupivacaine. So Ashley knew what bupivacaine was. It was a drug that was basically only used in surgical anesthesia. But Ashley had never heard of anybody abusing this drug or overdosing on it, because bupivacaine does not make you high like morphine or fentanyl does. It's closer to Novocaine. It's like a numbing agent. And so Ashley told the officer how weird it was, the idea that she had died of an overdose of bupivacaine of all drugs. And the officer agreed with her. But regardless, he thought Ashley should know, because he thought it was possible that Dr. Kaspar had gotten the bupivacaine from the Surgicare Center. And so, feeling totally confused, Ashley thanked the officer for telling her, then they hung up, and then Ashley walked to the OR hallway to check the drug cabinet where drugs like bupivacaine were stored. But as soon as she entered that hallway, the second thing happened that day. Ashley heard chaos break out inside of an operating room where she knew an 18-year-old boy was undergoing what should have been a routine sinus surgery. And so she watched helplessly as the doors flung open and a nurse came running out into the hall to call an ambulance. And then inside the room, Ashley saw an anesthesiologist performing chest compressions on this boy, and another doctor was administering oxygen and blood pressure medication. It was the same nightmare playing out now for an 11th time. But this time, after the EMTs wheeled this boy away to be driven off to the local hospital, Ashley was so desperate to figure out what was going on here that she just couldn't wait. And so she rounded up a couple of hospital staffers that were nearby, and they went into that operating room, and they checked the medical equipment, they checked the drugs that had been used, they searched the floor for anything that might have had something to do with this. I mean, they even searched the trash can. And in the trash, Ashley found something that the second she saw it, it made her blood run cold. She couldn't believe somebody would do something this awful, or why they would do this. And so she took the thing she found in the trash and she ran out of the operating room and upstairs to call the police. Minutes later, two police officers arrived at the Surgicare Center and they saw what Ashley had found in the trash. When they looked at it, they knew they had a very serious situation on their hands. And so right away, they roped off the operating room where this 18-year-old boy had been, and they began looking for evidence inside of there. And then also, they began reviewing the security camera footage from the OR hallway. And as they reviewed this footage, they would find something truly chilling going on in that hallway that totally explained all of the sudden cardiac arrests that had been happening inside the Surgicare Center. This is what they saw on the clearest piece of footage, which was shot 5 days earlier on August 19th. A hospital employee is seen walking down the OR hallway carrying a stack of papers under his arm. He walks past a couple of his colleagues and he arrives in front of this big metallic device that sort of looks like a refrigerator, and he opens it up and he reaches inside and he pulls out a saline IV bag. Now, when he does this, nobody else in the hallway bats an eye, because this is a totally normal thing to do. That metal device was a warming machine where saline IV bags were stored to be used during or after surgeries. At any given point, this warmer would contain a few dozen IV bags, and whenever it got low, certain staff members would restock it. But the police watched this footage over and over again, and they saw this employee who walks up to the warmer was not just carrying a stack of papers. He was also hiding something within those papers, his own saline IV bag. And so before this man takes out an IV bag from the warmer, he takes this hidden one and places it in the warmer as well. So he's basically swapped one for one. And this was absolutely bizarre because it was not his job to be restocking the warmer. He shouldn't have been putting anything inside of the warmer. And so about 30 minutes after this employee has placed his own IV bag inside of the warmer, a nurse comes out of the OR, walks down the hallway, opens up the warmer, takes one of the warmed up IV bags, carries it down the hall, goes back into the OR, and minutes later, her patient goes into cardiac arrest. It would turn out that nurse had inadvertently grabbed the saline bag that the male employee had secretly placed just minutes before. And she didn't know that that saline bag is what caused the cardiac arrest. Nobody knew until days later when Ashley is so desperate to figure out why all these patients are going into cardiac arrest that she began searching through the trash, and she would find an empty IV bag, and she would see very clearly there was a little puncture on it, just big enough for a needle. And so after seeing this security footage, the police analyzed that empty IV bag that Ashley had found in the trash with the puncture on it to see exactly what was in that IV that went into the 18-year-old who also went into cardiac arrest. And inside, they found a combination of 3 drugs that when combined are like a biological bomb that will send somebody into cardiac arrest within minutes. They were lidocaine, which is an anesthetic, epinephrine, which is basically pure adrenaline, and crucially, the third drug found was bupivacaine, the anesthetic that Dr. Melanie Kaspar had overdosed on, which caused her to die of a heart attack. And this discovery meant that Dr. Kaspar's death was almost certainly connected to these poisoned IV bags. In the few days before Dr. Kaspar's death, she had been feeling sick and dehydrated. And on the day of her death, she was feeling so unwell at work that, unbeknownst to any of her colleagues, she had taken a saline IV bag from that warmer and brought it home with her to rehydrate herself. But unfortunately, the one that she grabbed was one of the poisoned ones. When paramedics arrived at Dr. Kaspar's home, they found her still with the IV needle in her arm. But at the time, nobody connected her death with all of the cardiac emergencies at the Surgicare Center. Well, nobody except for the employee who was actually poisoning the IV bags. That employee was an anesthesiologist, but it was not Dr. Chad Marsden. It was the person that Dr. Marsden had to get out of the way for in the hallway that first time his patient had gone into cardiac arrest. The man who was doing the tampering was Dr. Reynaldo Ortiz. He was 58 years old, and he had only worked at the Surgicare Center for about a year. And he had flown mostly under the radar there until May 19th of 2022, which was about a week before the sudden unexplained cardiac arrests had begun at the Surgicare Center. On that day, on May 19th, Dr. Ortiz had allowed one of his patients to stop breathing, nearly killing the patient. And so as a result of that incident, Dr. Ortiz had been placed under internal investigation by the Surgicare Center, and he was facing the possibility of losing his medical license because of negligence. So to try to avoid losing his medical license, Dr. Ortiz decided he would just try to make all the other doctors look negligent too, taking the attention off of himself. And so he began sabotaging his colleagues' surgeries by injecting those drugs into their patients' IV bags, knowing it would cause cardiac arrest. Now, none of the patients who went into cardiac arrest at the Surgicare Center died. However, Dr. Kaspar, who took that tampered IV bag home with her, did die. And so ultimately, Dr. Ortiz was responsible for her death. In April of 2024, Dr. Ortiz was found guilty on multiple charges, and he is currently facing a sentence of up to 190 years in prison.
From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story. And also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Karis Allen Pash Cooper. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chaleli. Our managing producer is Sophia Martins, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our